In the summer of 2018, the Watts family appeared to have a picture-perfect suburban life. They lived in Frederick, Colorado. Chris Watts worked as an operator for Anadarko Petroleum. Shannon Watts ran an online business promoting health and wellness products and regularly documented family life on social media. Their daughters, 4-year-old Bella and 3-year-old Celeste, known as Cece, were often featured in their videos laughing, playing, and spending time with their parents. Shannon was also 15 weeks pregnant with a son they plan to name Nico. To friends and followers online, the family looked happy, but behind closed doors, there were growing problems. Financial stress had followed the couple for years. Court records show they had previously filed for bankruptcy. There were ongoing concerns about bills and debt. During the summer of 2018, Shannon traveled to North Carolina with the girls for several weeks while Chris remained in Colorado for work. During that time, Chris began a relationship with a coworker, Nicole Kessinger. Phone records, interviews, and digital evidence later established that the relationship became serious over a matter of weeks. They went on dates, visited museums, and discussed the future together. Investigators would later learn that Chris had told Nicole that he and Shannon were already separated, even though that was not the full story. As weeks passed, Shannon became increasingly concerned about changes in Chris's behavior. Friends later described text conversations in which Shannon expressed confusion. She felt Chris had become distant. He wasn't calling as often. He seemed emotionally detached. She wanted answers. Hi, everybody. I'm Will Coates, and this is Open Investigation. On tonight's episode, we will be going into the case of Chris Watts in that whole case, if you know what I mean. And I will be reading from my computer and what I wrote. I have not studied this because I spent all night writing it. But if I get stuff wrong, don't don't make fun of me, guys. Anyways, in August 2018, Shannon traveled to Arizona for a work conference. Friends who attended later recalled that she appeared tired and worried about her marriage. She frequently texted Chris while she was away. Those messages, later included in the investigation, show someone trying to understand why her husband seemed so different. Late on August 12th, 2018, after delays to her flight, Shannon finally arrived back in Colorado. Just before 2 a.m. on August 13th, her friend dropped her off at the Watts home. A neighbor's security camera captured Shannon walking toward the front door. It would be the last confirmed sighting of her alive. What happened inside that house remains known only through Chris Watts' changing accounts and physical evidence investigators later uncovered. Over time, Chris gave multiple versions of events, some of which contradicted earlier statements. Because of those inconsistencies, investigators relied heavily on forensic evidence, digital records, and the timeline they were able to verify. On the morning of August 13th, Shannon had missed a doctor's appointment. She wasn't responding to calls or text messages. That immediately worried her close friend, Nicole Atkinson. Nicole knew Shannon was well enough to recognize that something was wrong. She drove to the Watts house. Shannon's car was still in the garage. Her shoes were inside. Her phone wasn't answering. No one came to the door. Nicole continued calling and texting. Eventually, she contacted police. That decision would change the course of the investigation. Officer Nick, sorry if I butcher this, Baumover, Baumover arrived at the Watts residence to conduct a welfare check. At first, no one answered. Chris Watts, who said he was at work, returned home. The body cam footage released by law enforcement shows what happened next. Chris appeared calm. He unlocked the front door. Inside, investigators found Shannon's purse, her phone, her medication, the family's car. Everything suggested she had not planned to leave voluntarily. As officers searched the home, Nicole Atkinson became increasingly emotional. She repeatedly told officers that Shannon would never leave without her children. Chris attempted to explain the situation. He said Shannon had taken the girls after an emotional conversation about their relationship. but there was no obvious evidence supporting that claim. Investigators also noticed Chris's demeanor. Although poli- Although people respond to stress differently, detectives later testified that certain aspects of his behavior drew their attention. None of these observations proved anything. Combined with other evidence, however, they became a much larger picture. One of the most significant early developments came from next-door neighbor Nate. Nate invited officers and Chris into his home to review footage from his security camera. The camera faced part of Chris's driveway. The video showed Chris backing his work truck into the garage during the early morning hours of August 13th. Normally, according to investigators, Chris parked on the street. On that morning, however, he positioned his truck much closer to the garage. The footage the footage itself does not clearly show what was loaded into the truck. Investigators instead considered it alongside phone records, GPS data, work logs, and Chris's later admissions. While watching the footage, Nate quietly told officers that Chris wasn't acting like himself. The body cam videos captures this conversation, and investigators later cited it as one of several observations that increased their suspicions. Chris appeared visibly uncomfortable while the footage played, although body language alone is not evidence of guilt. Investigators were already beginning to compare what they were seeing with the timeline that they were building. By the end of that afternoon, what had begun as a missing persons case was rapidly becoming something much more serious. Later that day, Chris Watts agreed to speak with local television reporters outside his house. Standing in the driveway, he asked for his family to return. He said he wanted Shannon and the girls to come home. The interview spread across national news almost immediately. To many viewers, it appeared to be the emotional plea of a worried husband. To experienced investigators and to many members of the public who later watched it, the interview raised questions. Again, the interview itself did not prove guilt, but detectives continued comparing Chris's public statements with the evidence they were collecting. Over the next 48 hours, search warrants were executed, electronic devices were seized, phone records were examined, witnesses were interviewed, digital evidence began painting a timeline that differed sharply from Chris's account. The investigation was accelerating, and within days, it would lead detectives into one of the most well-known interrogation rooms in modern true crime history. In part two, we'll be discussing how detectives began uncovering digital evidence, the GPS records, and witness statements that challenged Chris Watts' story. We'll examine the evidence, the investigation step by step, the polygraph examination, and the interrogation that ultimately led to his confession. This has been Open Investigation. I'm Will Coates, and thank you for listening. And I'll see you next week.